In the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, where history lingers like an unsettled spirit, stands the infamous LaLaurie Mansion, a house of horrors, whispered about in hushed tones. Its walls have absorbed nearly 2 centuries of dread. For a brief time, it belonged to Nicolas Cage, a man drawn to the macabre as if by fate. But whatever he sought in its shadowed corridors, he did not stay to find. In 2007, Nicolas Cage, then at the height of his career, purchased the LaLaurie Mansion for $3.45 million. It was a peculiar acquisition, even for someone with Cage's eccentric tastes. Perhaps he was drawn to its nefarious legend. The house of Madame Delphine LaLaurie, the cruel 19th-century socialite whose attic became a chamber of horrors, where enslaved people suffered unspeakable fates. Locals claim Cage never spent a night there. Whether due to his demanding career or something more sinister, his visits were infrequent. But when he did come, he spoke of an unsettling presence, shadows moving against the grain of candlelight, cold gusts on the back of his neck in airless rooms. There were nights when the silence was too complete, and others when whispers slithered through the halls, speaking in voices no living soul could understand. Then, in 2009, financial misfortune struck. Cage lost the house to foreclosure. Some say it was the IRS that took it from him. Others believe the house itself rejected him, as it had done to so many before. For years after Cage's departure, the mansion remained a silent sentinel on Royal Street, changing hands discreetly. The current owners, a private family with old money ties to Louisiana, have refused all public inquiries. They never open the house to tourists, and the few who have spoken about it claim the new residents have undertaken extensive renovations, though no permits have been filed with the city. The mansion's windows, once gaping dark voids, now glow faintly at night, though no one ever sees movement within. Construction workers have refused to return, some abandoning their tools inside. One, interviewed anonymously, spoke of strange occurrences. Tools vanishing and reappearing elsewhere, guttural murmurs beneath the floorboards, doors slamming shut on windless days. Neighbors whisper of a new phenomenon. Once, the mansion's ghosts were known for their howls and clanking chains. But now they sing. Late at night, an eerie, lilting melody drifts from the second floor, accompanied by the faint rustle of skirts just before the gas lamps on Royal Street flicker and die. When asked about his time as the owner of LaLaurie Mansion, Cage offers a wry smile and deflects. "That house is a piece of history," he once said in an interview, "but some history doesn't want to be disturbed, and so LaLaurie Mansion endures, an ever-present enigma in the heart of New Orleans." Cage is long gone, yet the house continues to claim its own silent, patient waiting. The LaLaurie Mansion stands as it always has, its facade a decaying testament to the past, a house that refuses to let its story end. The iron balcony, once graced by the silken hems of Madame Delphine's gowns, now collects rust in the thick, humid air. Vines creep along the stonework, their tendrils curling around the dark shutters, as though the earth itself is trying to pull the house back into silence. No one lingers outside for long. Tourists may stop for a hurried snapshot, their voices hushed, their hands uneasy on their cameras, as if expecting something unseen to press against the glass panes above. Locals cross to the other side of Royal Street without looking up, shoulders tight, their steps quickening as if pursued. It is the kind of place that feels alive when it should not. No one sees the new owners come or go. Their arrival had been as unremarkable as a shift in the wind, a name signed on a deed, a quiet transaction buried in records no one thought to check. They were not the type to entertain curiosity. For a time, the house remained shrouded in an unnatural quiet. The air around it felt thick, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. The windows, once empty sockets in a skull of stone, began to glow faintly at night, not with the warm flicker of lamps, but with something colder, something pale and watchful. Then came the renovations, though no permits were ever filed. At odd hours, hammering could be heard from within, measured, deliberate, each strike carrying through the fog-choked streets. The sounds of movement echoed from the second and third floors, heavy footfalls pacing as if the house were restless. And yet, The workers never spoke, never left through the front doors, never gathered outside for a cigarette or a moment's rest. No one ever saw them, but something was changing within those walls. Rumors spread among the few who dared to inquire. A delivery man, bringing fine imported wood for some unseen project, was kept waiting outside for nearly an hour before the gates creaked open. A figure tall, gaunt, shrouded in shadow emerged just far enough to take the shipment. His fingers, long and oddly pale, closed around the clipboard, signing with an ink so dark it seemed to sink into the paper. The man glanced past the figure into the house, and that was when he saw the rooms. Beyond the grand doorway, past the flickering sconces, lay a space that should not have been there. The floors stretched endlessly into darkness, the furniture standing stiff and untouched, as if waiting for someone to return. The wallpaper, peeling in long, curling strips, revealed something beneath old murals, their paint cracked and faded, depicting scenes too grotesque to be mistaken for history. Figures writhed in shadows, their faces blurred, their hands outstretched toward something unseen. A woman, her hair flowing like ink, stood in the center, her eyes painted an unnatural white, and above her, a shape loomed indistinct, yet there. Watching, the delivery man turned, breath quickening, heart hammering against his ribs. The figure in the doorway had not moved. "Sir," he stammered. The man said nothing, but in the stillness, a whisper slithered from the depths of the house, low and insidious, speaking in a language older than the walls themselves. The gates slammed shut behind him. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The delivery man never returned to Royal Street. In the following weeks, his co-workers spoke of his sudden resignation, of his refusal to speak about that night. He left the city entirely, retreating to a small town along the Mississippi, where the humid weight of New Orleans could not reach him. His last words to a friend uttered over the rim of a glass that trembled in his hand were strange and directionless. "I saw the house looking back at me, and still the mansion stood, patient and waiting, as it had for nearly 2 centuries. It began with the rats. Or at least that was what the neighbors told themselves. It was easier to believe in vermin than in something less tangible, something less explainable. The scratching came at night, first a light scuttling, then a more deliberate sound, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap, like knuckles against wood. By the 3rd week it had grown louder. A woman living in a nearby apartment swore she heard voices under her floor. Not in the walls, as one might expect with pests, but below the very foundation. They rose in the early hours before dawn, soft at first, no more than murmurs, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. Then came the sobbing, low, choked, gasping like someone struggling for breath just beneath the floorboards. Some nights it was a woman, others it was a child, but always it was desperate. The woman packed her bags and left without telling her landlord. No one ever saw the new owners in the daylight. They were not like Cage, who had come and gone under the glare of flashing cameras, who had laughed with curiosity at the house's history before it turned cold against him. These new residents were quieter, more careful. If they walked the halls at night, their footfalls did not reach the street. If they stood at the windows, their figures never cast shadows. And yet, the light inside the house remained. At first, it was mistaken for candlelight, weak and flickering, barely perceptible from the street. But as the weeks passed, it brightened. It did not pulse like fire, nor did it waver like the glow of lamps. It was steady, constant. A man living across the street swore he saw figures moving behind the glass. Not people, at least, not people as he understood them. The shapes were elongated, shifting in ways that did not follow the rules of flesh and bone. Their movements were too slow, too deliberate, as though the weight of time pressed differently upon them. One evening, he sat on his balcony, staring up at the house. The windows on the 2nd floor were dark. The 3rd floor windows, however, glowed faintly. A figure stood there, watching. The man held his breath. His fingers curled around the railing. The figure raised a hand and knocked 3 times against the glass. The sound echoed across the empty street. The man turned away, shut his door, and did not open his curtains again. The mansion had always been restless, even when it was empty. Doors that had been latched would swing open on their own. Bolts would slide free. Keys would vanish. But now it was worse. The front door, massive, heavy, reinforced with iron, had been sealed since the new owners arrived. Yet there were nights when passers-by saw it standing slightly ajar. Just enough to reveal the yawning darkness within, just enough to invite. And then there were the whispers, low, coaxing, seeping from the crack in the door. They did not call for help. They did not call for mercy. They called for names. For those who did not walk fast enough. For those who turned their heads at the wrong moment. For those who, despite everything, still believed the house was just a house. The house did not want to be empty. It never had. There were nights when the wind carried the scent of old wood and something deeper, an odor that did not belong to the living. A dampness, thick and cloying, like the breath of something that had been sealed away for too long. It drifted from the mansion in slow, deliberate waves, curling through the narrow streets, slipping into alleyways, settling in the lungs of those unfortunate enough to pass. And then there was the humming, soft, lilting, like the remnants of a melody half remembered. It came from the upper floors, weaving its way through the ironwork of the balconies, drifting down like mist. It was never clear, never distinct enough to make out the words, if there were words at all. But the tune was familiar. It was the kind of song one might have heard long ago, in a parlor filled with candlelight and the rustle of skirts. A song meant to soothe. A song meant to lull. A song meant to keep something asleep. But it was waking up. They say the house has changed. That the walls are not where they should be. That the rooms do not stay the same. The few workers who have entered, men who arrived under contract, brought in by money no one could trace, have spoken in hushed voices, their hands unsteady as they sipped their drinks at bars far from Royal Street. One man, his shirt still clinging to the sweat of his labor, swore that the staircase was different every time he looked at it. The steps twisted at impossible angles, leading him up when they should have gone down, forcing him to double back when he was sure he had not moved. The banister, smooth beneath his fingers, seemed to pulse like something alive, like something breathing. Another, younger and less inclined to believe in ghosts, had been tasked with checking the attic. He had laughed at the stories, had rolled his eyes at the idea of spirits and curses and things that did not belong to the waking world. But when he came back down, his face was pale, his lips bloodless. He would not speak about what he had seen, only that the attic was bigger than it should have been, that it stretched too far, the floorboards vanishing into darkness, that he had heard something moving in the farthest corner, something heavy, something that did not belong, and that, just before he turned to leave, he had felt a hand press against the back of his neck. Not a cold touch, not the brush of a draft. A hand, warm, solid, breathing. He did not return. None of them did. The new owners remain unseen, unheard, their presence more rumor than fact. No one knows how many of them there are, or if they are truly a family at all. Their names are absent from the city's records, their purchases handled through channels too tangled to unravel. But there is a name, not one that appears on paper, not one that is spoken aloud. It was scrawled in the dust of a long-forgotten ledger, written in ink that had seeped too deep into the parchment to fade. A name older than the house, older than the city. A name that has no origin, only whispers. A name that should never be called. But the house knows it, and soon so will everyone else. The mansion did not sleep. Even in the dead hours of the night, when the French Quarter should have been silent, the house remained awake. It did not creak the way old homes did not settle into its foundation with the soft sigh of aged wood. No, the sounds that leaked from its walls were deliberate, measured, and knowing. The low groan of shifting beams, the soft scrape of something dragging across the floor, the whisper of fabric against stone, as if someone unseen was moving through the halls, their footsteps lost beneath layers of time. The glow behind the upper windows was no longer faint. It had taken on a sharper quality, less like candlelight and more like the pale shimmer of moonlight on water, except it came from inside, from places where no lamps should be burning. And there were shadows now, stretching long and thin, moving when nothing else did. The house was changing. Or perhaps it had always been like this, waiting for someone to notice. The first letter arrived at the post office 2 streets away. Its paper brittle, its ink faded with time. The envelope was unmarked, no return address, no postage, as if it had simply appeared. The postmaster, an old man who had seen more than his share of strange things in New Orleans, hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single page, yellowed and delicate, written in looping script that did not belong to this century. I have seen the house. I have walked its halls. But I am not the first. The second letter arrived 3 days later. It is older than they say. Older than her. She only unlocked the door. She did not build what was inside. The postmaster burned the letters after that. But more came. Always unmarked. Always appearing without explanation. The last one he read before resigning was short. No more than a single line. It knows who looks for it. There were reports scattered, uncertain, spoken in uneasy tones by those who dared to pass the house after dark. The mansion, once abandoned and lifeless, was no longer empty. Figures moved behind the lace curtains, their shapes indistinct, their outlines blurred as if the air around them was wrong, as if they stood just on the edge of reality. They did not flicker like candlelight, did not waver like shadows cast by movement. They were steady, watching. A man walking home late swore he saw someone standing just inside the front door. A woman, her dress dark and heavy, her head tilted slightly as if listening. Her face was hidden in the dim light, but he knew with a certainty he could not explain that she had been looking at him. He quickened his step. But as he passed, he heard something behind him. Not footsteps, not breath, a soft knock, 3 times. Slow, deliberate. When he turned, the door was closed, but he could still hear it. The sound of knuckles tapping against wood. Not from the front of the house, from inside, from the walls. The city tries to forget the house. The tour guides still mention it, still weave their tales for the curious and the foolish, but they do not linger. They hurry past the iron gates, their voices lower than before, their words clipped and cautious, as if they fear being heard by something listening within. The records remain unclear. The new owners exist, and yet they do not. No one sees them. No one speaks to them. But sometimes, at night, a name slips from the lips of those who dream too deeply. A name they do not remember saying. A name they wake up whispering. Their throats dry, their hearts pounding. The house knows its name, and soon it will make others know it too. The house had been waiting. Through the long stretch of years, through its many owners and their whispered fears, through Nicolas Cage's hurried departure and the silence that followed, it had waited. The weight of its past had never truly settled. The echoes of what had been done within its walls never fully dimmed. It was not the kind of place that could be abandoned because it was never truly empty. It had never been just a house. And now, after so many years, after so many failed attempts to hold it still beneath the weight of history, it was awake again. The first disappearance was dismissed. A man in his early 40s, a historian fascinated by the LaLaurie Mansion, had come to New Orleans under the pretense of research. He had spoken to guides, traced his fingers over the curling ironwork of the gates, taken photographs of the windows where flickering light could sometimes be seen. He had even written about the strange feeling he got when he stood too close to the house. "It's like it knows I'm here," he had scribbled into a notebook. "Like something just behind the walls is aware of me." 3 days later, he was gone. His hotel room was untouched. His rental car still parked where he had left it. His belongings remained, his wallet, his keys, his notebook all placed neatly, as if waiting for their owner to return. But he never did. There was no record of him boarding a plane, no sign of struggle, no calls made in the dead of night. He had simply ceased to exist. The second disappearance was harder to ignore. A woman, local, a journalist who had been investigating the mansion's newest inhabitants, had told a friend she was going to try and get inside. "Just a quick look," she had said. "No one ever sees them, right? Maybe they'll talk to me." Her last message was sent at 2:47 a.m. "I think there's someone in the courtyard." Not sure if they saw me. By morning, she was gone. Her phone was found in an alleyway 3 streets away. The screen shattered, the last message unsent. It's open. The city turned its back on the mansion after that. It had always been part of the quarter, a fixture of whispered legends and guided tours. But now, there was a change. The air around it felt thicker, heavier, charged with something unspoken. People crossed the street without thinking. Carriages and cars alike avoided slowing down as they passed. Even the light from the street lamps seemed to dim when cast against its walls. And those sounds that had once been attributed to old wood and shifting foundations were different now. No longer just knocking, no longer just footsteps, but breathing. A slow, deliberate inhale, a long, rattling exhale, as though the house itself had lungs, as though something inside it was drawing breath. No one knows when the letters stopped appearing. Perhaps they had never truly stopped, perhaps they had simply changed hands, passed to those who did not understand what they were holding. What is known is this: one last letter was found, long after the postmaster had burned the rest, long after he had fled the city, refusing to so much as speak of what he had seen. It was discovered in the back room of an abandoned bookstore, buried beneath a stack of forgotten pages, its envelope brittle with age. The ink was dark, still wet. The house remembers. The house is waiting, and the door is open. There was no signature, no way to know who had written it. But at the bottom, beneath the last line, in writing so faint it could barely be seen, was a name. The name that had been whispered in dreams. The name no one had spoken aloud. The name the house had always known. And when it was read, when the sound of it was formed in the mind of the one who found it, the house let out a sigh deep, long, a sound of something settling into place. The glow behind the windows brightened. The walls creaked, stretching as if awakening from a long slumber. And somewhere inside, down the long, endless halls that had no right to exist, a door that had been locked for centuries finally swung open. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.